Okay, welcome to Panguitch, everyone. We're happy to be here today as part of this virtual farm tour. I thought that was pretty classic of Matt to create a video and then him watching it. That was pretty impressive. Today we're going to talk about the grazing demonstration that we started on the Panguitch farm, and we've had this farm in Utah State's care since 1909. So it's been over 100 years, almost 110 years. And anyway, the farm's about 140 acres. We currently have about 70 acres dedicated to grazing and grazing demonstration and research. This is just a map of the farm. We've got riparian areas along the Sevier River. We've got some native pasture that hasn't really been improved and has probably been grazed over 100 years and continuously grazed or sustainably grazed, I should say. And we've got some improved tall fescue pasture that's been in about 16, 17 years, and then also some meadow brome, which was just after the ARS, Kevin Jensen and Blair and those guys released cash meadow brome. We were able to plant about 16 acres with their newly released variety, and it's still in production. Then we have some research plots, and then we've got what we call the alfalfa, but it has since been converted to some pasture research that Neil was talking about. Those Panguitch plots are in that alfalfa. Anyway, what we've done, as I mentioned, we're doing a demonstration, and we're converting conventional managed pasture. So in the past, these pastures were basically you turned the cows in one pasture, and then when they were out of feed, you opened it up, and then when you got towards the end of the fall, you opened up all the gates and just let them have their pick of everything. So it was kind of a continuous semi-rotation, but fairly large pasture rotation for the number of cows that we had. And then we learn about all this best management practices and what we should be doing, and the management intensive grazing and all that stuff. So we decided to say, hey, let's test this out. We have data on production data on or actually grazing days or amounts of the number of cows and the number of days, and let's see if we can improve this grazing system, which is a conventional system. It's what a lot of folks do here in the Panguitch Valley. And anyway, so we went to an intensive grazing, and so each one of these we did electric fence, temporary electric fence, and we kept track of the pasture numbers and worked through each of the pastures. And so this was the first grazing over here, second grazing, third grazing, and fourth grazing that as we move those cattle through the pastures. This is a chart comparing the amount of forage harvest and the stock density. Basically, when you start putting those same number of animals in smaller pastures and doing the management intensive grazing that Matt talked about, you increase your stock density, which is the number of live pounds of animals on a per acre basis. And so in 2016 was when we started this project, this demonstration project, and we've kept it going for that. This will be our 5th year. We you can see well, in 2015 you can see the number of grazing days. The estimated amount of forage harvested was about 88 ton, and then stock density of about 3,500 pounds of animals per acre. And in 2016 we said, well, we want to really go extreme on this, and we were putting cows in, quarter to half acre, third acre pastures, and really forcing that and moving every 12 hours. And you can see that we got about a 21% increase in the amount of forage harvest, or maybe the grazing days would be a little more appropriate to say. And we felt since we were kind of changing management, we wanted to be conservative. We felt we were doing a very conservative estimate on this stocking rate. And you can see that we increase that every year. Last year we kind of stepped back. We probably maximized the sustainable productive level, and so we've increased the amount of forage about 70% over what. And I should use the amount of forage. I use that term very loosely. We should say we've increased the amount of grazing days compared to the AUM. So, and we've kind of figured out our stock density should be somewhere in the 30,000 to 25 to 30,000 pounds of live animal per acre. Has worked well for us in this demonstration. Many of you have studied cool season pasture grass production, and you understand the dynamics of the production curve, and that right now we're in the dog days of the summer, and we probably estimated our pasture yield back in May and put out too many animals, and now we're really suffering for a little extra feed, a little bit extra forage, just because those cool season grasses are shut down. It's too hot. They're waiting for it to cool off and the day lengths to get a little bit shorter, and then they're going to start flushing out some more growth in the fall. One thing that would really help us out is if we had some legumes in the mix, and that helps balance out this forage curve. And that really is the challenge of pasture management, is matching your animals to the amount of forage available. And typically we put cows or calves or whatever we're grazing, sheep, goats, and they get bigger as the time goes on, and we forget that, and we think, well, our grass production is sustainable, or it's a consistent production schedule, and it's really not. It's dynamic. But again, going back, we could really use some legumes in many of our pastures to increase this. So we did actually with this project, and it was done across the state of Utah. We had Jacob Briscoe do a research project, and typically when we go to plant things in Utah, we think spring and fall is the best time to plant. Anyway, he did some research conducted all across the state of Utah, and found that the best time to plant legumes in existing pasture grasses, particularly these cool season pasture grasses, was during the summer. That's when we had the best success rate. And so we took this research data that was just completed 4 or 5 years ago, and said, well, we need to get more legumes in our pasture systems here in Panguitch. And a farmer down the road planted purchased a plant ovator, which is supposed to no-till in different seeds, and you can do cover crops and you can do legumes, and we were interested in the legume aspect of it as far as incorporating more legumes into our pastures. And basically it has a steel shank, a ripper, and I think there's what is there, eight rippers on this thing, and then it has a disc opener, and then it drops it, so it rips open the soil, the sod, drops the seed in the place, and then kind of covers it back up. And I should say, I'm not endorsing this by any means. It's just what we use, what was available. And a lot of the research that Jacob did showed that you've got to do something to the pasture grass. You've got to disturb it in some way, whether you spray it with Roundup or mow it or do a light disking or tilling to disturb the soil and suppress that cool season grass long enough for those legumes to get established. And you think, wow, this is a pretty neat piece of equipment, and it actually is, and it worked quite well. Other than when the soil was too wet, it just plugged up, and I didn't plant a lot of acres, 2 or 3 or 4 acres at the most, and I think I spent more time unplugging this thing than I did actually planting, and it would just when the soil was too wet, it would rip up large chunks of sod, which would bind up in the planter. And of course, there's only one way to get it unplugged, and that's with a crowbar and shovel. And it takes a lot of time and sweat equity to do that. So with that, did make a little video, and let me pull that up. And we'll see if this works. Okay, Rhonda, can you see my video screen?
I can.
Okay, all right. So, so this is our Penguich farm. It's 6,600 feet elevation. These are some native pastures that have, like I mentioned before, had been grazed probably over 100 years. And these are private cows that are leasing this pasture, and they allow us to use them for demonstration. Straight Hereford cows crossed with Angus bulls and make a pretty good cross. We use just a single wire electric fence with those plastic poles, insulator poles, and we move those around and can create different shapes and sizes of our pasture. We use a single float or a single water trough with a float on it for about 42 cows and a bull. Again, this is some of our native pasture that we're looking at right here. They were probably moved into that this morning. So this is why we're interested in looking at improving our pastures. This is pretty monoculture of tall fescue, and dog days of the summer, you're just not getting a lot of growth out of it. So we're looking at ways to improve our production. So obviously, this is just across the fence, or not across the fence, just 20 yards down the field where there's been some legumes established, and you can see the amount of forage difference in the pasture yield off of this. Just, I think, probably a volunteer alfalfa plant. So this is what that plant ovator where we reseeded, and we reseeded them the summer of 2019. So that's basically a year ago. And you can see pretty definite rows in many cases. That's what you can see. In other cases, it's not quite as pronounced as what we're seeing here. And I don't know that I need to go into too much detail in why we want legumes other than it increases the forage production, but it also saves us on nitrogen fertilization cost, which more than likely has already been covered here. And we planted, I believe it was 5 different types of legumes. We planted alfalfa, red clover, bird's foot trefoil, Sicer milk vetch, and sainfoin. And we seeded these into existing pasture. Alfalfa seems to be the king of forages, not only for hay production, but also for interseeding, because we've had the best response from that. Probably the next best has been this red clover. I have yet to see bird's foot trefoil establish, or Sicer or sainfoin, and I'm hoping the Sicer is just a late maturing, and it's going to come in to play a little later as we get further down the road. This is just an overview of the diversity that we can see in this pasture since we've interseeded the legumes, and we're definitely seeing a lot more. We seeded this at a very high rate. I'm not certain that it's cost effective. We have a lot to find out and experiment, and before we can start recommending. What we did find was that if it was successful, we've got a pretty substantial population of legumes that's going to help the pasture productivity in terms of actual forage, and then also nitrogen sequestering ability.